Do you like my lovely pink lighting I've got? Because I got a like glass pink lamp over here, so I guess I'm gonna be pink today. So a while ago, I rewatched the 2020 version of Emma. I want to say recently, but it was more like a couple months ago. And I rewatched it because I really kind of fell in love with that movie more than I expected to, honestly. I'm not a type of person to rewatch things, to reread things, to replay through any kind of thing. So the fact that I came back to the movie actively and wanted to rewatch it was something really significant. There's something so just charming about that movie that I absolutely just love. And one of the things that really I loved about that movie so much was the soundtrack and the music to the movie. It's so just beautiful and charming, and it's just got this beautiful personality to it. And if you have not watched the 2020 version of Emma, I would highly encourage you to go and watch it at some point, either before or after or in the middle of watching this video. I don't care. Give it a watch at some point. But recently, after watching a few clips that kind of brought me back to that movie again, I recently got to thinking about the scenes where we see people like Emma and Jane playing the piano. And I started thinking, what would a music education have looked like for a woman like Emma during that time period? And so I sat down and decided to really dive into the research of this question. I read way more than I was expecting to and learned a whole bunch of other topics. But in today's video, I really wanted to sit down and answer that specific question. So let's talk about that. So first and foremost, for any of my viewers who may not be super familiar with the story of Emma, it's a movie based on Jane Austen's novel of the same name, Emma. And typically when we're talking about Jane Austen novels, most directors will set Jane Austen stories within what's known as the Regency period in England, which was about maybe 1800 to 1820, give or take about a few years. That's really roughly when the Regency era of England was. And usually for the movies, this is often chosen because this is the same time period when Jane Austen was publishing her books. For example, Jane Austen's novel Emma was published in the year 1815, so right about in the middle of the Regency era. And obviously the 2020 version of the movie itself reflects that. We see that in the costumes, we see that in the scenery, we see that in the way the people address each other. All of it is perfectly set within this Regency era of England. And that's really important if we're going to answer the question what the music education of a woman like Emma would have looked like. We need to understand the time period that we're specifically talking about. So that would probably put us within about maybe 1810 to 1820, or if you really want to be broad about it, we could say the late 18th into early 19th century. So before we get into the actual music education conversation, let's start by talking about what a woman's education would have looked like during this time period. Well, beyond the basic elementary education that all children would have gotten during this time period, women, specifically of the middle to upper class, were expected to study various accomplishments. This would have been subjects such as drawing or music or dancing, and they were symbols of a woman being a part of a higher society. So a music education of a woman like Emma was not only just standard, but it was actually expected for a woman to have some kind of knowledge about music. But why was a woman having these accomplishments so important to so many families? Well, it showed off two really big things. First, it showed that a family had enough money to educate their daughters in these specific subjects. I mean, think about it today. Are subjects like dancing, art, and music cheap things to learn? No. And they weren't cheap back then either. You had to get a specific tutor to come in and teach your daughters about these subjects. So a woman having gone through this education showed that a family had enough money to teach her in these subjects. Not only that, but it also showed that the woman had enough free time to learn these subjects. See, women who didn't really have free time were more likely working women. And if a woman could distance herself from a working woman, if she had enough time at home to sit around and just simply learn various subjects rather than having to go to work, it showed that she could be financially supported by her family, that her family had a decent amount of money, and that more importantly, her family was of some kind of higher status. So having these accomplishments really was a financial and status thing for many women. Because of course, the things that the middle and upper classes of society wanted to do more than anything else, it was distance themselves from the classes that were lower than them. And of course, the poorer classes of society really couldn't afford to send daughters off to get educated. Daughters had to help and contribute to the home, and so of course they had to work and make money for their families. But middle classes and upper classes could afford to keep their daughters at home. Their daughters didn't have to do anything. That in itself became a sort of status symbol. But families didn't really want their daughters to do nothing with all their leisure time, because idleness, they suspected, could lead to less savory activities. So they wanted to fill their daughter's free time with things that were seen as proper, with things that were seen as good activities, with things that made a daughter seem, well, accomplished. So what specifically would this music education have looked like? Well, for starters, if you look at even just portraiture of this time period of the late 18th into early 19th century, we see tons of women sitting at clavichords, harpsichords, other keyboard-like instruments, holding mandolins or guitars, sometimes harps, and lots of women holding sheet music, in other words, showing that they're singers. So these were the most common instruments that we see women performing. But of course, we know there's plenty of other instruments that were there during this time. So why don't we see portraits of women playing other kinds of instruments? Well, mostly because it was often considered unladylike. If a woman had to purse her lips in order to play the flute or the clarinet or some kind of horn, that was certainly frowned upon. Even a violin, a woman having to tuck her neck unnaturally and potentially, you know, violinists, you get marks all over your neck and your shoulder. Yeah, that's an unladylike thing to be doing. And a cello, where you have to spread your legs to hold it? Absolutely not. So there were certain instruments that just society of the time considered to be less ladylike than the dainty and delicate instruments of the clavichord and the mandolin. Now, I wanted to throw a quick note in here about stuff I came across in my research to people who may be really concerned that all women of this time period were oppressed and were told that the only thing that they could learn was music, dancing, and drawing. Because it's important to note that it wasn't like there was one universal sexist opinion about what women could and could not learn. Take, for example, Maria Edgeworth's Practical Education. Now, this book is a whole entire book that Edgeworth wrote about what is good principles for children's education. And in this book, she dedicates an entire chapter just to young women's governing and education. And she spends a good chunk of this chapter talking to parents about how they should be careful about how they view their daughters' accomplishments. One example that Edgeworth herself gives within the book is a hypothetical conversation between her and this imaginary mother, where she basically asks the mother, if you could dedicate 90% of your daughter's livelihood into learning music and being a very accomplished musician just for her at the end of all her learning and education, be able to perform just one prestigious concert, would you do it? Would you sacrifice that much of your daughter's livelihood? And the mother thinks to herself and goes, just one concert? Probably not. That's not really worth it. But you know what I would give anything for is for my daughter to be the best performer in all of England. Just think of the social circles she could get into, which goes to show that it was not an uncommon line of thinking for some families during this time period to think about their daughter's accomplishments simply as a way of raising them up in social circles, not for any actual important form of education. And it's here that Edgeworth points out that this heavy focus on accomplishments, it might only be done by certain families just because it's fashionable for the time period. At one point, she writes, "The dress of today is unfashionable tomorrow because everybody wears it. The dress is not preferred because it is pretty or useful, but because it is the distinction of well-bred people. In the same manner, accomplishments have lost much of that value which they acquired from opinion since they have become common." Edgeworth then goes on to compare these accomplishments to previous skills that women were expected to learn, such as tapestry making, and points out how tapestry making really isn't in vogue anymore for women to learn, but now these other skills are. And she points out that families need to be careful not to teach women these skills simply for the sake of it's fashionable, it's what everybody else does. And specifically, she writes, "We hope that no one will so perversely misunderstand us as to infer from these remarks that we desire to see the revival of old tapestry work, or that we condemn the elegant accomplishments of music and drawing. We condemn only the abuse of these accomplishments. We only wish that they should be considered as domestic occupations, not as matters of competition or exhibition, nor yet as the means of attracting temporary admiration." And most importantly, she writes towards the end of the chapter that these accomplishments should not be the only things that women learn. One of my favorite quotes that she wrote towards the end of this chapter was, "Sentiment and ridicule have conspired to represent reason, knowledge, and science as unsuitable or dangerous to women. Yet at the same time, wit and superficial acquirements in literature have been the object of admiration in society, so that this dangerous inference has been drawn, almost without our perceiving its fallacy, that superficial knowledge is more desirable in women than accurate knowledge. This principle must lead to innumerable errors. It must produce continual contradictions in the course of education instead of making women more reasonable and less presuming. It will render them at once arrogant and ignorant, full of pretensions incapable of application, and unfit to hear themselves convinced. Whatever young women learn, let them be taught accurately. Let them know ever so little apparently. They will know much if they have learned that little well. A girl who runs through a course of natural history, hears something of chemistry, has been taught something of botany, but knows just enough of these to make her fancy that she is well informed, is in a miserable situation, in danger of becoming ridiculous and insupportably tiresome to men of sense and science. But let a woman know any one thing completely, and she will have sufficient understanding to learn more, and to apply what she has been taught so as to interest men of generosity and genius in her favor." So Edgeworth makes a really good point to families who may only be teaching their daughters accomplishments simply because they can climb societal ladders. She points out that women who really only learn a little bit of the basics and bare minimum of everything, rather than going in depth and studying something and really truly understanding it in their education, may have problems in terms of how they come across to other people, which is bad for society. And she also points out how they can come across poorly to men, which is bad for any kind of marital prospects. And again, bad for the women who, if they want to be a part of society. And so she really appeals to them in what they'd be thinking of and points out why it's important for women to have a full, rounded education rather than simply just focusing on accomplishments. I really felt that was important to bring into this conversation to point out that yes, we often talk about women having to learn accomplishments, having to learn these seemingly frivolous subjects, having to learn these things and these hobbies for the sake of showing off how little she had to work. But it's also important to point out that while some families probably thought that that was the only important thing for women to learn, there was plenty of schools of thought of people who pointed out saying, hey, this is gonna cause problems if your women don't know anything else. Not only just because it's important for her to learn this, but you know, if your focus is, I want my daughter to climb in society, you know, it's gonna cause her problems in society if she isn't educated and she kind of looks ignorant. But side note over. Let's go back to our main point of music education, since that's what started this whole discussion. Now that we know that the subject of music was a very standard subject for middle class to upper class women's learning. So like I said earlier, we're talking about the Regency era of England, or perhaps, like I said more broadly, the late 18th into early 19th century. So this is a really unique time in terms of music history because we're transitioning out of the classical era and into the Romantic era. So the type of repertoire that young musicians would have had to work with is really unique. We would have been coming off the classical era, so we would have had a lot of that to work with. And meanwhile, we've got the very beginnings of the Romantic era just starting to come out in composers such as Schubert and Beethoven. But it's important to point out that if we're talking about a woman like Emma, she's probably just an amateur musician, nothing super professional. So, you know, if Beethoven comes out with a big orchestral piece, you know, that's not something an amateur musician is going to be playing. So what would a young woman amateur musician have been playing during this time? Well, let's go back to one of the scenes from the movie Emma. There's a specific scene in the 2020 version of Emma where we see Emma sitting down and playing at the piano. She's playing and singing the song The Last Rose of Summer. This is accurate for this time period. This specific melodic setting of this poem was published in an 1813 book of Irish tunes by Thomas Moore. This song also shows off that Emma can both sing and play piano. Basically, in other words, she's well-rounded in her music education. But let's compare this to what Jane does when she steps up to the piano. So Jane sits down and plays the third movement of Mozart's K332 Sonata in F major. Again, this is also very accurate. It's a classical era piece, not too old to be considered old-fashioned, relatively contemporary, and within the whole late 18th, early 19th century time framing that we have. But it's also really well done because it really shows off the difference between Emma's music education and Jane's. I mean, even on a surface level, most people can tell that Jane is clearly the better performer between Jane and Emma. But digging into it and really understanding women's music education during this time period, we really see how much this specific piece emphasizes the difference between what Jane has accomplished versus what Emma has accomplished. Emma picks a simple folk tune, something relatively easy that a lot of people could have done, and she's very proud of herself as she walks back to go sit down in the audience. Meanwhile, Jane steps up to the plate and performs a Mozart sonata, which is not easy. Mozart's not an easy composer to perform. And this shows the difference between someone like Emma and Jane. Emma comes from a lot of wealth, and so high status, high wealth, she would have had a lot of money and free time on her hands to be able to dedicate herself to something like music. While someone like Jane, while still in the upper echelons of society, comes from a much lower status than someone like Emma. Her family doesn't have as much time and money to dedicate to something like music. Yet, Jane is clearly the better performer at performing something so much more difficult than The Last Rose of Summer. If Emma had really wanted to dedicate herself to her accomplishments, she could have performed something by Clementi, Kuhlau, or Johann Christian Bach, or even some of the easier pieces of perhaps Beethoven, Mozart, maybe even Schubert during this time period. But instead, she picks a folk song. Now, that's more used as a storytelling device to really show the difference between Emma's character and Jane's character. In all actuality, all women of the middle and upper classes of society of this time could have performed any kind of song of any kind of difficulty. It's not to say that upper class women had to perform harder pieces and middle class women had to perform easier pieces. That's all just a matter of skill and ability and time and whatever. You know, even upper class women didn't necessarily have to dedicate themselves only to music if they wanted to dedicate themselves more to drawing, for example. So what are other examples that weren't necessarily shown in the movie? So I gave a few composer examples of the piano, so what about singing? That's really the other big area. Well, on the easier side of things, we have more folk songs, similar to what Emma performed. But of course, some women were more accomplished musicians, like Jane was, and so more accomplished singers could have performed more difficult pieces, such as arias from famous operas of their time period. But also, since we're in this transitional period from the classical era into the Romantic, German lieds were another genre that was becoming more and more popular during this time period. And so it wouldn't have been too uncommon for more amateur musicians to perform these easier German lieds. And of course, if a young woman has lots of siblings who are also very accomplished in their musical abilities, she could possibly perform chamber music with them. So that's the accumulation of the rabbit hole of research that I really dove into this week to try to answer this question. I learned so much more than I expected to going into this, and I hope that if you were ever thinking about this question, that this also kind of answered the same thing for you as well. And of course, if you really like these kind of in-depth research videos and you'd like to stick around to see more of them, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I upload mostly every week, and of course I always talk about subjects of this kind of music history and education type nature. But yeah, that's really all I had for this week's video today. So if you like this video, feel free to subscribe, but otherwise I'll see you next time. Goodbye.